Coming up.
The government, on one hand, is shutting down TikTok's subsidiary, but at the same time, Canadians are free to use the app. And I don't necessarily see why not, but there doesn't seem to be a consistency in terms of...
Is TikTok's algorithms furthering anti-Semitism in Canada by teaching a narrative?
Utilisez-vous TikTok?
No.
Monsieur Lind?
Do you use TikTok? Mr. Lind, do you use TikTok? Okay.
The risk is so great that the government has ordered the shutdown of this entity. However, please feel free to continue to use the app. Well, what's the message that Canadians should take away from that?
This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
I'd like to welcome our witnesses for the second hour today. From the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, Daniel Rogers is here as the director, and Paul Lind, the Assistant Deputy Minister, Intelligence Collection.
With respect to personal data being shared with the Beijing-based regime, you cited the 2017 National Security Law. Theoretically, it would seem to be true that there is a risk of data of Canadian users of TikTok to be shared with the PRC, but the position taken, the evidence we heard from TikTok when they came before this committee a few weeks ago was that that data had not been shared and that indeed a firewall had been set up to prevent the sharing of such data. Can you speak to that?
Well, I can speak to the first point, which is that we are concerned, there is concern about the risk of that data going to the PRC. As I think this committee has heard before, that data is not housed entirely in Canada, and there are questions about the applicability of Chinese law to Chinese companies, including the parent company of TikTok, which is ByteDance. So it is certainly foreseeable that data held by TikTok Canada could, as you suggested, end up in the hands of the People's Republic of China.
But at this point, it seems to me to be theoretical and nothing more than that.
Well, I can't speak publicly to any specific instance of data that's gotten there that we would have known through intelligence, but that is a certain risk that many of us are concerned with from a national security point of view.
And from the standpoint that it is a risk, how does shutting down the subsidiary of TikTok affect that in any way? It would seem to me that it is entirely unrelated, but to the degree that there is a risk, the risk continues, does it not?
I think it's a fair point. You're correct that the subsidiary TikTok Canada does not eliminate the use of the application here in Canada, nor the data that it holds. I would note it, going back to my opening remarks about the consistency of the decision with previous policy statements, and to say that the decision-making in that context is in an ICA process where certain events trigger decisions and reviews by the ICA, which is administered by ISED, and CSIS provides national security advice in the context of those triggered reviews.
Okay, thank you for that. And I will say, for you, Mr. Chair, that it is troubling to see the total lack of transparency on the part of this government with respect to this decision. Because the government, on one hand, is shutting down TikTok's subsidiary, but at the same time, Canadians are free to use the app. And I don't necessarily see why not, but there doesn't seem to be a consistency in terms of if the objective is concerned, for example, the use of personal information or personal data being shared with the Chinese communist regime, the solution that the government has come up with doesn't seem to achieve that at all. But I would just try to at least understand from the theoretical standpoint of personal data being shared with the PRC that TikTok did set up Project Texas, which ensures that U.S. data stays in the U.S. So I'm trying to understand when you say that there is a risk and that some of that data could be shared and would not entirely be housed or to remain in Canada. Well, what do you mean by that? Because it could be stored in the U.S. or what?
The concern in general is that the parent company of TikTok Canada is a Chinese entity and subject to PRC laws, which could compel them to act in ways of getting data or using the platform for other means that China sees fit, or the Communist Party of China sees fit. And so that risk continues to exist.
Now, is it the case that the Chinese company, ByteDance, operates the algorithm and owns the algorithm?
That's my understanding.
Okay. And in terms of that operation, is it in China, in the PRC, that it is operated, that algorithm?
I'm not well placed to speak to
Okay.
the specific operations of TikTok. That would be a better question for them. But I imagine that there is a more distributed nature of that. I couldn't speak to that with any credibility.
Okay. So, because, I mean, it would certainly, at least from a theoretical standpoint, in terms of the risk, be an issue to the degree that the algorithm is operated by the Chinese company ByteDance. In order for the algorithm to work, data necessarily would have to be shared with ByteDance, and to the degree that the algorithm was being handled by ByteDance in that regard, then yes, pursuant to the 2017 national security laws, they could be compelled to share data with the Beijing-based regime. The problem that I see is that I don't see any evidence that that, in fact, has actually happened. It seems to be entirely
Mr. Cooper.
theoretical.
Yeah. So we're over time. Mr. Rogers, do you have a quick response to that, or it was more a comment than it was a question, I think. But,
Right. I think I've answered that, but
Okay.
I'm happy to.
Okay. All right, so just for the benefit of committee, I did ask the clerk to reach out to TikTok to see if they would be available, because I thought they would be material to this discussion, and as you may or may not know, they did file a legal challenge against the federal government shutdown order, so not surprisingly, they declined to, or they weren't available to appear today. So, Mr. Housefather.
Is TikTok's algorithms furthering anti-Semitism in Canada by teaching a narrative that turns people or users against the state of Israel?
I will certainly say that rhetoric and narratives like the narratives that you describe are pervasive across many social media platforms, not just TikTok Canada. I don't have a specific point to raise here about TikTok Canada's algorithm specifically in relation to that. As I mentioned earlier, we're very concerned with the amount of content online that serves to radicalize particularly youth against any number of targets, including the Jewish community, the LGBT community, and many other targets. That's a trend that we're consistently worried about and increasingly worried about.
So would I be at least correct in assuming that this is ongoing activity that CSIS is looking at with respect to monitoring extremism coming through the TikTok platform and other similar platforms that are being used today in Canada?
Yes, TikTok and other platforms. In fact, we and our Five Eyes allies, along with our law enforcement allies, recently put out press release and guidance related to the radicalization of youth online very specifically. It's a challenge for us investigatively because often people are radicalized only online, and particularly youth. So that is a worrying trend.
Utilisez-vous TikTok?
No.
Monsieur Lind?
Do you use TikTok? Mr. Lind, do you use TikTok? Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I don't use TikTok either. I don't have a reason to.
Mr. Green, 6 minutes. Do you use TikTok?
I did, yeah,
You did, yeah.
quite regularly, and in fact stopped once the Canada-China investigations revealed targeting of MPs. Certainly, the list of social media interference or influence within democratic political election processes are well noted and well documented. Going back to 2016, you'll recall Cambridge Analytica Lots of instances around Elon Musk's participation in the most recent election in the States. So through you, Mr. Chair, to Mr. Rogers, first of all, welcome to committee. I think this might be the first time I've had a chance to chat with you. In your opinion, how does TikTok differ materially from the way in which user information, data, algorithms, and profiles are used from other social media platforms?
Thank you for the question. To the extent that I can answer it, what I will say is that there are general concerns that Canadians or others may have around social media platforms that we're engaged in. Things like the spread of disinformation, the ability for those platforms to be used by people to radicalize Canadians or those who might seek to do harm to Canada. That's not something unique to TikTok. It's something that is generally done across social media platforms. The concerns that tend to be particular to TikTok have to do, again, with the regime that it can operate under because it is hosted and controlled, in theory, by China and the national security laws. We know that, what important factor of data is how it can be used. And in Canada and in other countries, there are differing privacy protections, legal recourse. In Canada, we have charter protections. There are many things that are inherent to our country that are not the same in China.
In your review, do you have any evidence or intelligence that you're able to publicly share that would indicate that TikTok had broken any Canadian laws?
Well, I can say that in our review, we were clear in the decision-making process about the national security concerns related to TikTok Canada as an element of our decision-making. I can't speak to the specifics on those, but I will also say that it doesn't require TikTok to have broken Canadian laws for us to have national security concerns, and that's.
Do you have? Sorry, my time's limited, so I have to take it back. Do you have concerns of other platforms? For instance, Truth Social, X, Discord, WhatsApp. We're talking about this hopefully in a more comprehensive way than just targeting one platform. Would you care to comment on the threats for radicalization, as you've mentioned numerous times here at committee, from the other platforms?
Our concerns around the spread of information and radicalization are not specific to a particular platform, and nor have we, at least to my knowledge, I've only been the director for 6 weeks, but to my knowledge, we've not conducted such a similar review of either of any of those platforms at this stage, certainly not as part of the ICA process. As I've said, our concerns are to do more with the content and the potential for Canadians to be radicalized on those platforms.
Define radicalization. You use the term, but what does that mean legally? Yeah,
thank you for asking. And in our context, that typically means, I use it as shorthand for radicalization to violence. So what we're concerned with is not, there is a threshold. People are allowed to have a freedom of expression in Canada. People can say what they wish in social media, and they can consume the information that they wish. But radicalization for us is the process that someone may go through to take what are beliefs and translate that into the potential or the intention to commit violence and harm people here in Canada. My colleague Paul, I don't know if you have anything you want to add on radicalization.
Yeah, I would say that's essentially accurate. It's mobilizing towards providing support to violence or conducting a violent act.
What would be some examples of that in Canada recently?
Well, you've seen probably a number of arrests relating to individuals who have espoused radical ideologies and may have been planning attacks, in some cases youths. Examples of that include people who live in an echo chamber online and may have fewer connections outside to temper their what they
Those aren't examples. Those are generalities. Like, to be specific, the Quebec City massacre at the mosque, Ibrahim Jami Mosque in Hamilton firebombed, the London family who were run down. Would those be specific examples of radicalization?
I don't want to get that wrong. We have seen, and I won't use the name, I certainly know that some of the arrests that have been made this year have been linked to radicalization online as a primary factor. I don't want to give you misinformation and give you the wrong name associated with that, but I'm happy to report back if that's helpful.
If you're able, can you list in the case of TikTok the principal national security risks that you identified that led to the Government of Canada's decision to order it to wind up?
I can't speak to the specifics other than to say that we provided a national security assessment that highlighted some national security risks.
Are you okay? So what would be the risks of disclosing to this committee some of this information publicly?
Well, for one, I think there are decision-making privileges in cabinet confidence that we have to respect as part of the government's decision-making. Also, there is a matter before the courts that will have to go through a fair process there, and I need to be conscious that that process hasn't yet unfolded. And there may be classified information that could reveal sources or techniques, or may have been shared with us by our allies who would not allow us to describe it publicly.
So, obviously, under the CSIS Act, you have a duty of candor to the courts. If in the process of the civil case you're asked these questions, you'll be forced to, in fact, disclose this. It's not correct?
Well, I can't offer specific legal advice. I know that there are processes to protect information in various legal proceedings in Canada, which which may be applicable in this case. I have not done a detailed review of how this case might unfold and what information might come to light.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Green. Thank you, Mr. Rogers. That concludes our first round, and I'm sure there will be lots of eyes on this court case for sure. Mr. Barrett, you have 5 minutes. Go ahead, sir.
With respect to the decision that was taken under the Investment Canada Act, what alternatives or other options are available other than a complete shutdown of an entity here in Canada?
Some of those questions may be better directed to ISED Canada, who applies most of this act. And again, our input is limited to providing a national security assessment. That said, I do understand that there are other options available, including applying mitigation mechanisms, but I wouldn't want to speak to that on their behalf.
Okay. And is there a type of mitigation in a, for example, that you could offer?
None comes to mind right away. I apologize, that's not CSIS's area of expertise in the Act.
Okay, so if there's a national security risk so great that under the Investment Canada Act that the headquarters of this entity has been shut down or ordered shut down in Canada, but users, Canadians, are not restricted in their use of it, what are Canadians to make of that when the risk is so great that the government has ordered the shutdown of this entity? However, please feel free to continue to use the app. Well, what's the message that Canadians should take away from that?
Well, I can say from CSIS's perspective that we've been clear, as I have now, about the risks of the app itself.
Okay, so if I can you be clear? Should Canadians continue to use TikTok?
We have said, and I will say now, that there are national security concerns that we have around the use of TikTok in general, which includes the aggregate amount of data and the ability for the Chinese government to make use of that platform in ways contrary to the interests of Canada.
So you're saying Canadians should or should not use it?
I'm saying that the decision of a government to provide such a recommendation or decision to Canadians is best not made by CSIS. CSIS will provide a national security assessment, but it's very important that other factors be brought into those decisions. And the decision on TikTok Canada is very distinct from the decision on TikTok in general because there are very different factors in play.
Okay, so under the distinct question of whether or not individual Canadians, I'm not talking about a ban, I'm just talking about advice. You're the director of the leading organization in Canada's intelligence apparatus. You are at the foremost of this and at the forefront of this, and though new in role, appointed to it because of your qualifications with extensive experience in the intelligence community in Canada. Should Canadians continue to use TikTok? I'm not asking if the government should ban it for Canadians. I'm asking if, as the head of CSIS, if you believe it's wise for individual Canadians to use it.
I think that there's a very big distinction between an individual's choice to use something and the aggregate effect on Canadian national security. And so, for me, if I can give you a personal example, when I was young, I did not expect to be the director of CSIS. At the time, I may have looked at the information available to me and made a decision to continue to use TikTok because I wouldn't have thought that even if China had my information, I would have cared. I now care because I'm the director of CSIS. My perspective is that individuals need to consider their own risks, and that is an important factor in their making a determination. At this stage, I can't speak for government, but I can say there are risks that I hope Canadians consider when they personally decide whether to use TikTok or not.
So you talk about the aggregation of the data, the information, the pictures, the geolocation, the patterns, the habits of individual Canadians, that information being taken, potentially used by the communist dictatorship in Beijing, and aggregated. But with respect to the risks to individual users, I have just about a minute left. What are the risks to individual users, those younger Canadians, the young Mr. Rogers, the future director of CSIS? What are the risks to him in 50 seconds, sir?
Right. Well, one of those risks, and if the concern is that the Chinese government may access that data, they have seen, as we know, to engage in foreign interference in acts of transnational repression and other things that are contrary to the individual and collective interests of Canada. An individual now making use of TikTok would have to be aware that their data may be subject to that regime. And if you were someone who is vocally counter to the government of China or the Chinese Communist Party, you may have particular concerns immediately. If you are someone who's not in that situation, you may eventually have those concerns, and you'll have to take into account as an individual whether you want to take that risk.
And in my last few seconds, I hear concerns from businesses who operate, who sell their products here in Canada using TikToks, locally owned businesses in my community. What do I say to them? Should they also be concerned?
I think that the same advice applies. The data and the use of TikTok will be available through the regime that we've described, and they'll have to make those decisions.
Thank you.
Just stating, prolonged operations by TikTok could allow foreign actors to exploit Canadian user data or spreading disinformation. This is an accurate statement in your mind, Director Rogers?
I think I missed the beginning of your question. I think you asked whether TikTok Canada could allow for the spread of TikTok could allow for the spread of disinformation. Yes, that's true, and it's true of other social media platforms also.
So, yes, specifically, I said the operations by TikTok could allow foreign actors to exploit Canadian user data and spread disinformation. That's accurate?
Yes, that's accurate.
Okay, and CSIS, in terms of providing guidance on timelines for winding down the activities of TikTok to minimize potential risks to public safety and our democratic integrity, like what's been done?
Our role is to provide advice to the government in that regard. We've provided advice on a number of decision points, including the most recent one to wind up TikTok Canada. We also collect intelligence, obviously, and where we can collect intelligence that informs the government on how social media platforms are used by foreign adversaries or anyone who would seek to undermine the security of Canada, we would do that. And that classified information would factor into future government decisions.
Are you able to measure, like TikTok is being used by yes, it's based out of China, it's a China company, but it's being used by billions of people. And are you able to identify certain maybe hostile nations using it more versus others?
I'll invite my colleague to jump in if he knows more than I do. We've certainly seen foreign actors use many social media platforms, including TikTok. We've been fairly public about concerns around disinformation, misinformation, and influence done by Russia, China, and others. Paul, did you want to?
Sure. I would say the concern with TikTok is specific to its association with the PRC. You know, as has been mentioned here, TikTok collects a lot of personal data, has access to a lot of personal data on your device. And, you know, CSIS has been very public in warning about the risks of using TikTok, and it's very clear that there's a strategy on the part of the PRC to collect big data, personal data from all around the world and collect it. Now, the PRC is also the primary threat actor in Canada conducting foreign interference. So when you have that size of vast collected personal data, and then on top of that you could put AI and machine learning, then you could use that to sort through that data and then use it back against people. And so you could use it for foreign interference, for targeting individuals, for cyber attacks, for intimidating, influencing, and compromising in the future. And so this is really the concern, is the vast access that TikTok allows to personal data and the fact that the PRC national security laws would compel it to share that data with them.
The director can answer a question that TikTok itself couldn't answer. or at least wouldn't even entertain. From your perspective, as a member of parliament, why should I not be on TikTok?
That's an excellent question. I think that the risks that I mentioned earlier in one of my responses apply especially to members of parliament who may find themselves of interest to the Chinese government as a target of their influence. If your data is on TikTok and if China avails itself of that data, they may seek to understand more about you, more about your personal networks, and more about the ecosystem that you work in to be able to target foreign interference, espionage, cyber attacks, or other things toward you. Obviously, as members of parliament, you have particular access and influence in the government that most people don't enjoy, and I can imagine why you would be particularly interesting target for government of China.
How is that different from the other platforms? I mean, presumably we're in a surveillance capitalism, setting aside the state capitalist country of China. What's to say the Chinese government or the Indian government or the Russian government or the Israeli government or the American government couldn't simply just buy that information directly from Meta, from X, or from any of the other actors that provide these types of platforms?
Another good question. I will certainly not say that TikTok is the only concern we have with respect to Chinese access to data and its influence activities. It is certainly one of the things that we're concerned about, particularly given its the potential for its national security law to apply directly to a company headquartered in China. One of the primary differences between TikTok and others, and between China and others, is that China has shown a history of engaging in foreign interference activities specific to Canada. It has a very sophisticated and capable cyber program for intelligence collection and espionage, and tends to be the #1 cyber actor prominent in Canada. So with respect to which government, I think China's distinguished itself in a number of ways.
Does your threat assessment change if the same type of activities are being observed by a quote-unquote ally?
I think CSIS's act and mandate is not country-specific. We look at anything that meets a national security threshold for us and is contrary to Canada's national security interests. Right now, that certainly includes the PRC and tends not to include our allies.
But wouldn't it be rational to think that we're more influenced by American media and American information than we are any other foreign actor?
American media and, as I was mentioning earlier, the targeting of disinformation by certain foreign actors toward an American ecosystem certainly has knock-on effects for Canadians who consume information in that ecosystem also.
Interesting. Wasn't exactly the question I asked, but an interesting response. Thank you very much. I know my time is up, and I'll just say, Mr. Chair, I'm still with more questions than we have answers around this, and I would really appreciate any information through you, Mr. Chair, to Mr. Rogers, even if it's at the direction of an in-camera briefing. I feel as an opposition member, Mr. Chair, and I'm not saying this as a point of privilege, but I'll put it out there, that we don't have all the information still.